Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. The Radical Imagination has always been about a discussion of how to bring about a radically transformative world and what it might look like. A world imbued with the values of radical love and justice, where love is what justice looks like in public. A world where political and economic policies are created for the betterment of the common good, not one based on the greed of the very few. A world where militarism and the reliance on vengeance, punishment, domination, and disrespect of the other is no longer needed and used as a basis for social control. A world that's not on the brink of nuclear devastation, ecological catastrophe, and the takeover by fundamental religious nationalists. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination has borne witness to a lifetime of imaginative political struggle, challenging America's incomplete fulfillment of the progressive promises of its own revolution. In 1969, Bill Ayers co-founded the Militant Weather Underground. Described by the FBI as a domestic terrorist group, he was hunted as a fugitive for several years until charges were dropped due to illegal actions by the FBI agents hunting him. He went on to become a distinguished professor in the College of Education at the University of Illinois of Chicago, honored in 1997 with Chicago's Citizen of the Year Award for his efforts on public school reform. He's authored and co-authored numerous books and articles on social justice, democracy, and education, the cultural context of schooling, and the importance of teaching as an intellectual, ethical, and political enterprise. As a young fugitive, he wrote that you couldn't be a moral person with the means to act and stand still. To stand still was to become indifferent. Indifferent was the opposite of moral. Through it all, his life journey has remained true to that youthful choice of trying to heal a profoundly dangerous and hurt world. So, Bill, thank you so very, very much for being on the show. It's just really wonderful. It's just an honor and blessing to have you on.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm a little blushing with that beautiful introduction. I'm reminding myself that when I got my doctorate at Teachers College, my son Malik was 5 years old, and I came out of the defense. Wow. And he said, "Did you win?" Which I thought was an interesting take on a dissertation defense. And then he said, "Well, Papa, you're a doctor, but not the kind who can help anybody, right?" And I said, "That's right." And so I try to remember that, but that was a very sweet and generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, Jim.
No, but if I may start on a note, no, you're not right. Teaching is, as you pointed out, one of the most noble experiences and projects we could be involved in. And you especially, it's interesting that you are so good at it and have been so influential. So in trying to transform the world and make it a better place, it's so important to start with education at the very beginning. And you've been so articulate in expressing how important that is. So let's start there. You mentioned your son, and of course, I've seen clips of you talking about your wife and that initial interaction between the newborn infant. That's where we get the love and nourishment we need, literally. But it's more important than that even. It's interacting with each other, right? In ways that set the tone for a healthy society with people who can think for themselves, critical thinking. So fill us in on that.
Well, you mentioned my partner and my children. And one experience that I've used with my students again and again, my students who are becoming teachers, is exactly what you say, the beginning of life. I go back to watching our oldest son, Zaid, who's now 47, but he was born in our 5th floor walk-up in San Francisco. And what I write about and talk about with my students is here he was 5 minutes old. It was a long and complicated birth. The midwife wrapped him in, swaddled him, and put him on his mother's breast, and he began to nurse. And what I ask my students is, who was teaching whom how to nurse?
Yeah.
And the more you think about it, the more you realize that it was a dialogue, that while mom knew a lot, and she had been in the Leche League, and she had been spoken to her sister and spoken to the midwife, but really the baby, 5 minutes old, knew some things. He said, not this way, this way. That's not enough. That's too much. And over the next 18 months or 2 years, the dialogue of nursing, a very primal dialogue, established a relationship. And what's I think is important about that is to recognize that both people were both teaching and learning, that it wasn't a transmission from one direction to the other, but rather it was a dialogue. And I think that's, if a kid at 5 minutes old, if you can recognize that kid's agency, then what agency does that kid have at 15 years old or 25 years old? And why would we think that we have to always think of this kid as a target of instruction rather than as a subject who has agency, who has skills, experiences, knowledge that have to be taken into account? And for me, that's where real teaching begins. It begins by becoming a student of your students.
Yeah. Just on a personal level, did you experience that as a child yourself?
Very much so. I was very blessed and very lucky. I was the middle of 5 children, so I learned how to play up and down,
Right.
and I was very blessed in the sense that I had a mother who was devoted to our well-being. I had parents who were deeply influenced by Benjamin Spock, and really believed that that the point of childhood was to find your own way rather than to be shaped into some kind of a vessel for the aspirations of your parents. And I think they raised us that way. And I feel gratitude, every day for my folks and my older siblings and my younger siblings. I was lucky. I was born into a crowded little nest of people, and we learned how to get along together.
Same here. I'm the Spock generation. I was hit once by my mother, lightly on my rear end as I crossed the street, ahead of her, and she started crying. She said, called me Jamie at the time, and never again. But I didn't need to be hit. That's the point.
Yeah, but of course, you recognized right away that she did it. She was on your side. She wasn't against you. She was for you, and she was for you living. So there are times when obviously you have to intervene because you have more experience, or the grown-up has more experience, more knowledge, more clarity about both the threats and the possibilities. So the grown-up has to do many, many things. But what the mistake that educators make all the time is thinking of other people, children, as targets of instruction, and that they won't get anything unless we feed it to them and put it into their passive heads. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every learner is an active, growing, developing, dynamic, three-dimensional creature. And if you can recognize that and the excruciating complexity of that, then you're on your road to being a really talented teacher.
Right. And in my crowded nest, my mother was an artist and a musician, and we always had music, and she was always painting, so that by the time I was 4 or something, I begged her, please, can I learn how to play the piano? And of course, then she taught me and so on. And I had a double dose because we were living with my grandparents, who my grandfather was also an artist. So when they left, when my parents went out, I got the love and doting by my grandparents, and my grandfather was an artist as well. So he taught me, but your point's well taken. I wasn't said, well, you've got to go to art class. You've got to go to piano class. I begged for it. So, and it's so important to understand that and to bring that sort of interaction, that sort of dynamics into the classroom. And you've had much more experience teaching in inner city schools than I have, but I did spend a little bit of time, but it was just the opposite. It's a cruel environment and ordering people around. It's like being in the army, and it turns the kids off, and it's so counterproductive. So tell us about your experiences early on with the Summerhill experiment, because I also, O'Neill, I've read him when I was a kid, and the Freedom Summer Schools that you were involved in.
Well, I think there were many influences on me, but probably the most indelible influence was the Freedom Schools, which were part of the great Black Freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s. And to this day, I draw on the Freedom Schools for inspiration and guidance. They were a project. It's easy when you look back to think of the civil rights movement as kind of linear and a single dimension. But in reality, in 1963, the civil rights movement was on a downturn. Nobody knew where we were going. It was things that happened in the South, demonstrations, some changes, but it was a lull for the movement. And a young volunteer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Charlie Cobb, came up with this idea that one of the ways to rejuvenate and revitalize the civil rights movement would be to start freedom schools everywhere throughout the South where there were SNCC offices or SNCC projects. They would start freedom schools. And he wrote a proposal. And what was interesting to me about the proposal, this is now 1963, 64, is that it wasn't a proposal to the MacArthur Foundation or the Department of Education. It was a proposal to his comrades, to his colleagues. And what he said in this proposal is, the Black children of Mississippi have been denied many things: fully trained teachers, adequate facilities, forward-looking curriculum. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. Think about that. They've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. Now that, to me, if you think of the context of Mississippi in 1963, that was a revolutionary statement. And it was read that way by the powers that be. You may remember that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, three of the great martyrs of Mississippi, were all freedom school teachers. And they were out investigating the bombing, the arson bombing of a freedom school when they were kidnapped and lynched. So it was revolutionary. It was pushing the status quo aside and looking to a future of freedom and justice. And it was serious. So what they did is they began these schools, and the pedagogy of the schools was all questions. The pedagogy was asking questions. So the big questions were, why are you and I in the freedom movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What does the majority culture have that we want? What do we have that we want to preserve? And so on. From there were other questions. What is freedom of speech? What does the Bill of Rights say? Does it apply to us? And so on. So by pursuing these questions, the questions that were big and overarching, they began to develop a project where the agency and the force of ordinary people was made manifest. That, I think, is very much what good education does. So I'll go back to that opening statement by Charlie Cobb because it's relevant today. If we said to ourselves, what do the children on the west side of Chicago, what are they denied? Well, they're denied decent facilities, fully trained teachers, forward-looking curriculum, but the fundamental injury is no one's saying to them, what are the circumstances of their lives? How could they be changed? How would you want to change them? Those are revolutionary questions. Those are the questions that guided the freedom schools and, frankly, have guided my teaching for 50 years.
How old were the students that you were involved
Well,
with?
the students in the freedom schools in the South range from young kids to old adults. I mean, there were freedom schools that met. My podcast is called Under the Tree, and it draws that image from freedom schools because often they met in a park or a community center or a church or a synagogue, but they could as easily meet under a tree in a park as anywhere else. And you could ask the big questions because notice there's no right answer to the question, why are you and I in the freedom movement? There's no answer that's testable and verifiable. There's only the
There
ability.
isn't? Standardized testing doesn't do that?
That's what's
Doesn't
exactly
measure?
right, Jim.
Well, I was
And
going to get to that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Standardized testing does not get to questions of curiosity, agency,
Creativity.
aesthetics, creativity, all the arts of liberty that really any democracy depends on the arts of liberty. And so any curriculum that is for free people begins by saying, what are we curious about? What do we want to understand? What do we want to pursue? And so it foregrounds things like curiosity, initiative, courage, imagination, as you say, the radical imagination. How could things be different? And that's the arts of liberty. And those are the things that can't be captured on a standardized test, but are essential for free people to act freely and to live freely.
Yeah. And as you say over and over again, it's so dangerous because the patriarchal and structurally racist nature of our society doesn't want that to happen. Wants people to accept their lot in life, that nothing can really change, and accept their position. So we can talk about it in terms of one's soul, if you will, even, but one's also, you're rooted in your economic and political limitations as well. It's incredibly damaging and just wrenching. It doesn't enable a person to grow or develop in any sort of meaningful way. And the kids who rebel against that, who act out against that, are often, as you well know, they become the delinquents, the predators, or whatever you want to call them in the school. But they're responding, right, to a very, very toxic environment that they're trying to, in some way, deal with.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's worth what you bring to my mind is James Baldwin's iconic Talk to Teachers, which you can find online. It's simply called A Talk to Teachers. But he says very clearly that in order to live freely, you have to interrogate the world, and you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You have to be able to ask questions of the universe and deal with the answers you get. And Baldwin goes on to say, but no society wants that. Every society wants people who will go along with whatever the powers that be have, but that's not freedom. And that's not even close to the kind of citizens we need to nourish if we want to be a free society. So I think we should again and again come back to the fact that we want people who, and we want schools that nourish curiosity, question asking, problem posing, imagination, and so on. And we want to downplay. We want to eradicate in some ways the idea that education is all about following the rules and obedience and conformity. And yet, if you look at the schools that I've worked in most of my life, obedience and conformity is valued over everything. And that does not help us develop free students, free human beings. But interestingly, and I think you're pointing to this, that if you insist on obedience and conformity, there will always be people who say, no, enough. That's also part of the human condition, is to say, I'm not going to be bossed around forever. And if people don't find socially useful ways to channel that energy, then in many ways they find destructive ways. I think of Sylvia Ashton Warner, the great educator from New Zealand, and she described childhood as having two vents, is the way she put it, two vents, one the destructive vent and one the creative vent. And if you close the creative vent, you open the destructive vent. And I think there's truth to that. I think we need much more energy and attention to creating schools that really, really honor the arts of liberty.
No, totally agreed. And again, I've seen the acting out is acting out against the unhealthiness of the environment that the kids are experiencing. And by the way, that I think could also be said about college students at some of the elite universities who are never challenged to critically think as either. Just go and get the good position and become the part of the ruling class and so on. So let's get us into a little bit of those who fall by the wayside in a sense and get channeled institutionally into training schools and reformatories and eventually adult prisons and so on. And this is who you and I have come in contact with, is this incredible human being, Stanley Howard, whose book, Tortured by Blue, I can't believe that after what he's gone through, railroaded into prison, serving 39 years, 16 years in solitary confinement. He still has come out now, thankfully, and he's writing about it. He is fighting back, and he is using all his ingenuity, his creativity, to ask questions and to challenge the system that put him away. A system, as you know, in a sense, wanted him to fail. So we go from one institution to another. It's no, accident that you can go up to South Bronx and go to Spofford High School, and next door is Spofford Correctional Facility. So the kids can look outside and they're not dumb. This is what the system has for us next. It's not, Harvard or Yale or any. It's Spofford. So tell us a little bit. You've worked in prisons as well, right? You've taught in prisons.
Yeah, currently I've taught for a long time in prisons, and when I was much younger, I taught in juvenile detention centers. But I'm now teaching at Stateville Prison, the big Illinois state prison. But yes, there's many lessons to learn from that experience. And you're absolutely right that we've talked a lot in this country about the school to prison pipeline. Some of us have begun to think of it as the school to prison nexus. That is, the school, one of the rappers, a rapper named Fat Boy, who ended up doing time in Rikers Island in New York, he talked about the fact that he said, when I got to Rikers Island, I already knew what it was like because the same architect built my public housing project and my public school. And so when I got to Rikers, I was in the same place, autocratic, top down, authoritarian. These are the kinds of preparations for incarceration, not for freedom. But yes, I teach I'll say a word about Stanley, but I teach in the state prison. Stanley was in that prison for a long time. And I work with a group called the Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Program. We are a college degree granting program, and we are abolitionists to a person. That is, we think we should free them all. We think that prison is not the right answer to the kinds of problems that we're facing in our country, and that incarceration, carceralness, can become a philosophy that dominates us all. So prison is more than a place. It's an idea. It's an ideology. You talked in the beginning about resisting cruelty and punishment and these as the driving aspects of society. Well, prison is all of that congealed. It's violence, it's cruelty, it's mindlessness, all congealed. And teaching, learning, always requires a certain amount of free inquiry. Well, in prison, that the obstacle to that is even greater. So what I do in prison, I teach writing, and I teach writing memoir. And one of the things I love about my students is they're not taking classes to check a box. That may be true in a college or a university, but it's not true in prison. If you're going to go through this educational process, you're doing it because you really, really want to learn, you want to express yourself. And my students are highly motivated. But I say a couple of quick things because it's probably people who listen to your program undoubtedly have heard ideas like the Second Chance program. And there are many second chance programs, and I think they're great. But one of my students said very, very clearly, I'm all for the second chance programs, but I never had a first chance. When I went to prison, I was illiterate. I was living on the street. I was homeless, and I was surrounded by violence. So I want a first chance or a fresh chance. I don't just want a second chance. The other thing that he has said to me many times is, I love the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is helpful to getting people who are wrongfully convicted out of prison. But the fact is that I am guilty and I'm still a human being. What are you going to do with me? I did what they said I did. I was wrong. I have a lot to atone for. But what are you going to do with me? Are you going to house me in a cage until I die? Am I facing death by incarceration? So we have to really rethink prisons. And I'm glad you started with education, because frankly, the institutions of society reflect society. Education institutions and carceral institutions reflect what we value. And I think we are in need, as Martin Luther King said, of a revolution in values in order to lead toward a revolution in fact.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue into the Poor People's Campaign, which is going to be meeting in Washington just a couple days from now, and the whole idea of structural violence, where hundreds of thousands of poor people die unnecessarily every year in this country, and millions around the world, totally preventable, because again, we're not dealing with the root causes of poverty and all that entails. We'd rather put the funding again toward militarism and militarize the police and prison. So we're back again to how do we change politically, economically, as well as morally, of course, because as you know, prisons got started with this idea of trying to instill penitence. You're sorry for what you did. And, people are and should be. On the other hand, what about a system or society, politically and economically, that creates the conditions under which people do what they do? And as you pointed out before, not have the alternatives to constructively live a life of love and caring and so on. So we're back to the need, as I think you've pointed out over and over again, the need for these mass movements that come about every once in a while and very, very important to sustain, to make the sort of changes that are going to happen. It's not going to necessarily happen by electing this or that president or this or that policy, correct?
Well, let me say two things about what you're raising, Jim. First, we have a real-time experiment in Illinois happening right now, because our governor, a very liberal, progressive Democrat named J.B. Pritzker has announced that he's going to close Stateville Prison, the prison that I work in. And it's long overdue to be closed. It's a toxic, the building itself is impossible to live in. Nobody's been able to drink the water there for 2 years. So all water that's drunk is bottled water. I mean, it's a really hellhole kind of place. So he announced that they're going to close that. And everybody who has their head screwed on thinks that's a good idea, tear down Stateville Prison. But at the same time, he budgeted $900 million to build a new prison, a state-of-the-art prison. And as one of my students said, you mean instead of trying to end mass incarceration and the causes of mass incarceration, you're going to build a prison for my grandchildren who are not even born yet. But we already know from what neighborhoods, what backgrounds these kids are going to come from. Why would you do that? So I started a little experiment, and I began asking people, if you had $900 million and you wanted to make Illinois a safe and flourishing society, What would you spend it on? And I have gotten dozens of answers, from parks to upgrading schools to jobs programs to housing. But not one person has said I'd build a prison, because that's the most insane and stupid and backwards idea, because you're just perpetuating the injustices that already exist, that have already been identified. We've been talking about the new Jim Crow for almost 2 decades. We need to end it. And closing Stateville Prison would be a great step if we were going in the right direction. I'm going to refer back to Stanley Howard very quickly.
Sure.
We ended the death penalty in Illinois 20 years ago, and we ended it because of the brilliance of people like Stanley Howard. He was a jailhouse lawyer living on death row, and he organized the other death row inmates into what became a very vibrant organization called the Death Row 10. The mothers of the Death Row 10 became a lobbying organization. They spawned a mass movement in Illinois to end the death penalty. And 20 years ago, our Republican, right-wing, slightly corrupt governor did clear death row. That's because of the actions of the people who were most impacted themselves, Stanley Howard and his comrades, but also a mass movement. So you mentioned mass movements, and I just want to make one reference to it, really, which is we've seen now these encampments all over the country of students who are suddenly awakened to the fact that there's a genocide going on, and have decided that they don't want to let their lives make a mockery of their values, and so they act. This is an amazing moment we're living in, because you could look at it one way, Jim, and say, oh, these are the worst of times. Cold War in Asia, proxy war in Europe, genocidal war in the Middle East, or women being asked to step back into the Middle Ages, or racial killings by police ongoing without interruption. You could say that, but you could also, from another angle of regard, say this is the best of times. Right. That is, people are rising up in a way that's unheard of. Women are not going back into the closet or into the straitjacket of, having their bodily functions controlled by the state. Women are resisting. And I think, and the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that's happened since the George Floyd killing. I mean, 26 million people in the streets of the United States for racial justice, unprecedented. Yeah. So it's both the worst of times and the best of times. And I'm sometimes, I think, I'm thinking now of Charles Dickens. It was great, the best of times and the worst of times. Or Viet Thanh Nguyen, the great Vietnamese American writer, who in his second book, his second novel, The Committed, he says, contradiction, the universal body order of humanity. Yes, we are in contradiction, but because it's a contradiction and because there's no obvious one side or the other, we need to dive into that contradiction and move things forward as far as we can. I'm very hopeful about the rethinking that's going on because of the encampments, about the U.S. role in the world, about the U.S. relationship with Israel, about the reality of Palestinian human beings who also have a right to live. And I think this is just a critically important moment. And I'm looking forward not only to the Poor People's Campaign, but to the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Yeah, we're reliving 1968 here again. But again, that was another moment that we had as students too, to discuss and critically evaluate what we're doing. And yet, well, that didn't succeed in the way that we had hoped. And there was counter movements, as we all know. And let me say this. I just, last week I did a show with Cornel West's running mate. It's one of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter, Elena Abdullah. We spent some time on what was going on, of course, in Gaza and so on. And of course, it's what I find, what I would like to see more of is professors in education, a process that will enable both sides to begin to communicate with each other and understand each other's hurts and traumas I understand it's asymmetrical at this point, but what the Israeli government doing is just outrageous. On the other hand, you're talking about deep-seated memories and horrible experiences that are still being dealt with by many of the Israelis. So when you talk about, river to the sea, let Palestine be free, and so on, what does that mean? Let's have a discussion about that. You have extremists on both sides. Hamas would say, well, we just want all Palestinians. The extremists on the religious right would say, no, we want all the Palestinians gone. What about Hamas's role as well in subjecting its own people to building its, the tunnels just for themselves and not for the population? There is a beginning movement against Hamas as well, speaking out against that. So all I'm saying is it gets complicated. And I think
you're absolutely right. Everything is super complicated.
I mean, to have that.
Let me start where you started, though.
Sure.
When you said back in the 60s we didn't win, and I want to quarrel with that just a bit.
Well, we did. I was overstating.
I understand
what you mean. We're still here, right?
We have to always ask ourselves in social movements and when we're in organizations, what does winning look like? What is our North Star? And of course, we didn't. If I think of myself at 18, 19, 20, I wanted to end white supremacy. I wanted to end not just the war in Vietnam. I wanted to end the cause of war. Did I win? Right. No, I didn't. Our movement didn't even end the war in Vietnam. The war dragged on for at least 7 years beyond when we'd convinced the majority of people to oppose it. And in that war, millions and millions of people were killed. So no, we didn't win. On the other hand, we did change consciousness and we did learn things. And what you want to do from a movement like that is spring forward toward the next movement. You don't want to either romanticize or heroize or kind of, I find one of the most depressing things I find when I'm around people our age, Jim, is people who are nostalgic for a ship that already left the shore. I mean, get over yourself. We're living now. I'm a member of this generation. I don't want to color myself as a guy from the 60s. I'm from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and I'm a guy from right now. So I think that's important that we think of winning differently. So for example, I'll give you one quick example. When they executed John Wayne Gacy in Illinois, we had just moved to Chicago, and my partner and I, Bernadine and I, were so disgusted with the news coverage that we decided one of us had to go down and protest this state execution of this really terrible criminal, this guy who had done terrible, terrible things. But neither of us thought that killing him was the right way to go. So we drew straws. She stayed home and put the kids to bed. I went down to the prison, and I wasn't part of a movement. I was a sole individual, just disgusted. So I had my little sign that said, "Thou shalt not kill." When I got in front of the prison, I was shocked that there were thousands and thousands of people there to cheer on the murder of John Wayne Gacy. Yeah. And I found at the front of the prison 11 elderly nuns, 2 lawyers, and me. So if I ever felt marginal, I felt marginal that night. But we were on the right side of history. We were on the right side of morality. And 4 years later, one of the lawyers I was standing next to won the first wrongful conviction suit. And from there, the death penalty unraveled. And again, Stanley Howard and others played the kind of driving role in that. All I'm saying is that winning is complicated. And I don't think we'll ever win in the sense of having the kind of ideal world that you describe at the start of your episodes, a world of peace and justice and balance powered by love. But I think that should be our aspiration. That should be our North Star. And we should be working toward that. But now to pivot a bit to Gaza, it's not our responsibility as Americans living in the heartland of empire to decide how the Vietnamese should live, or how the people of Congo should live, or how the people of South Africa should live. It's our responsibility to oppose our imperialism, our aggressive, militarized bloated, conquering, occupying society, the biggest military the world has ever seen. That's our problem. And that's where we should focus our energy. When people say Palestine will be free, what they're really saying is that they want a secular state. Now, that's, I know, out of bounds. You're certainly right that there's trauma in every direction, but you could say that about the American experience as well.
Yeah.
People who came from England and from Europe and from the Great Migration from the South, these people also suffered, and they were hurt, and that hurt is generational, and it goes on. But none of that justifies the genocide of Native peoples. None of it justifies building up the wealth of the country through human bondage. And so we have to be clear that we have a specific job, and our job is to identify and to oppose imperialism and to insist that people have a right to self-determination, not just the Palestinians, but yes, including the Palestinians.
Absolutely. I couldn't disagree with anything you've just said there. I've had Cornel West on a few times in the show, and he's a dear colleague, and we've protested stop and frisk together and so on and so on. And of course, his campaign, I think, makes an important statement that I think you probably relate to very much, that it's a moment in a movement. And it's not so much about getting elected. This is a process. And we do what we can. And I totally agree with you. We're not back in 1968. Those were some good times, but this is good times too. And we can
exactly.
That's why we're doing this show, and that's why you're on. And
whether it's good times or not, this is the only time we have.
That's
right. So, a lot of people, especially old people, will say, oh, back in the day, or young people might say, oh, I wish I were alive in the 60s. I'm sorry, you don't get to pick your historical moment. You're thrust into the world just like everybody else. You didn't pick your parents. You didn't pick your nation. You didn't pick the religion that raised you. But here you are. But the big question facing you is, what will you do with this one precious life? How will you live that life in a way that doesn't make a mockery of your values? How do you know what your values are? And how do you embody them day in and day out? Those are the questions that should fire us up and freak us out.
There you go. To use a 60s term, freak us out. Do you hear that, everybody? All the 20-year-olds? But that gets us back to the education again. That's absolutely essential, and that's why you're at the epicenter, I think, of the struggle. And I think those on the right understand that. They've always been opposed to desegregation and so on, and are trying to control the curriculum and so on. And there's important reasons why they want to do that, and I think you've articulated it very much. And
well, I agree with you. But I'll just make one quibble, and that is that I agree with you. I think education is absolutely at the center of movement building and at the center of creating the kind of society we want. But I also have colleagues who are in the environmental movement, or who are my partner is in the juvenile justice world and so on. And what's interesting is that while I can see everything connected through the educational lens, my friends can see everything connected through the environmental justice lens. And I think both are true. And this is what I mean, Jim, that in order to build a mass movement for really fundamental change, we have to do two things, each of us. One is we have to reframe the issues as it's given to us. We have to go deeper. We're not going to, we don't want to talk about, Obamacare versus a crudely capitalist health system. We want to reframe that, as I think Bernie Sanders successfully did. We want to say healthcare is a human right. We want to reframe every issue. Education is a human right. We want to say that. We want to say environmental justice is an existential crisis. But then there's a second step, and that is connecting the reframed issue, whether it's healthcare or education or LGBTQI rights. We want to make the connections between all the issues. So we want to connect war and warming. We want to connect, the kind of scapegoating of gay people with women's liberation, with education, with freedom. And I think as we do this, we are more likely to create the kind of irresistible, exciting, dynamic social movement that we need if fundamental change is our North Star.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's not forget about the musicians,
Absolutely.
the artists, the dancers, the comedians.
No, when you talked in the beginning about radical imagination, my mentor at Teachers College was Maxine Green, and one of her iconic texts is called "Releasing the Radical Imagination." And one of the things that was so great about Maxine as a teacher, she was a brilliant teacher, but she always said, when we talk about imagination, let's not just talk about castles in the sky. Let's just not talk about, about this or that individual thing. She said, let's talk about the social imagination. And she would say, because it took a very, very intense imagination to imagine Auschwitz. That also took imagination, but that's not the imagination we want. We want a social imagination, a radical social imagination that rethinks everything from top to bottom in the interest of the community. That's what we are searching for.
And you know what we should also search for before we end this, which is just in a minute or so. Can we somehow get a picture of your T-shirt there? What it says?
Oh. Yeah, this is
Free them all.
Free them all, and this is the symbol of the Chicago Torture Memorial Group. We endured a 30-year regime of police torture, and part of the reason that the death penalty was abolished in Illinois was that many people on death row were not only technically innocent, but in fact had been tortured into confessions by a police department, Area 2. John Burge was the leader of it. And I'll tell you, this is another example where we should never be despairing. We should move beyond despair. We had a movement in Chicago and Illinois to bring John Burge to justice and to give reparations to the people who were tortured by John Burge. It took us years. None of us believed it was possible, but suddenly it was possible. Our city council passed an ordinance apologizing to the people who'd been tortured in Area 2 Police District and gave them each $100,000, built a memorial. Free Them All is part of that memorial, built a curriculum to be taught in all the high schools in Chicago about the Chicago torture moment. This is real reparations, an apology, actual money, and also a mental health clinic to deal with survivors of torture. What a great victory. And I think that it's important to remember that even though it seems impossible day to day that we can accomplish big things, we've accomplished big things before and we can do it again.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. I'm going to say it this way. Our energy, I think, is very similar throughout our lives, and you bring it out beautifully today in this show. Oh, I want to make sure everybody knows how to reach you in terms of your podcast. Tell us a little about that in the last minute we have.
Yeah, the podcast is called Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom with Bill Ayers. I have a book coming out in the fall. I'll be on book tour all over the country. The book is called When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. And it's essays on collective liberation. So look for it. And I appreciate you, Jim, very much. Thank you.
And I hope you make it to New York and we get together in person.
Oh, we will. And I'll let you know.
Absolutely. Sure. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much,
Thank
Bill.
you, Jim.
Stay strong.
Keep doing what you're doing. Keep rising.
You too.
Okay, brother. Thank you.
Take care. All the best.
Bye-bye.
And thank you so very, very much for watching us here again on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.